What's this?
So I have one sacred text. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil. Henry David Thoreau, 1846, on Walden. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Call the one a root striker. Here's the argument. There's a feeling today in my country among too many of my fellow citizens that we Americans might not make it. Not that the end is near or that doom is around a corner, but that a distinctly American feeling of inevitability, of greatness, culturally, economically, politically, is gone. That we have become Britain or Rome or Greece. Now, a generation ago, Ronald Reagan rallied the nation to deny a similar charge by Jimmy Carter, the fear that our nation had fallen into this state of malaise. And I confess, I was one of those so rallied, and I still believe that Reagan was right. But the feeling I'm talking about today is different. It's not that we, as a people, have lost anything of our potential, but that we, as a republic, have. That our capacity for governing, the product in part of a constitution we have revered for more than 2 centuries, has come to an end. That the thing that we were once most proud of, our republic, is the one thing that we have all learned to ignore. Government is an embarrassment. It has lost the capacity to make the most essential decisions, and slowly it dawns upon us that a ship that cannot be steered is a ship that will sink. Now, this is not a Democratic or Republican point alone. This is a genuinely multi-partisan frustration. The view that this government doesn't work is signaled by many different policy matters that get blocked on both the left and the right, blocked consistently and repeatedly in a way that should drive us Thoreauvians, to ask, what is the common root? Now, my job here tonight is to brainwash you a little bit about what that common root might be. I want to do that with 3 examples. So as described in the introduction, I spent many years of my life focused in the area of copyright. And I became a copyright activist on October 27, 1998, when President Clinton signed into a law a statute in honor of this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Now, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. And the question Congress was to ask when it passed that statute was whether it could advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright by 20 years. Now, a copyright, of course, is a monopoly given to create the incentive to produce something new. And what we know about incentives in this universe, put aside Star Trek for a second, but in this universe is that incentives are prospective. Not even the United States Congress could get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So that when we challenged this statute in the Supreme Court and had a brief signed by 13 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including this liberal Nobel Prize, this is Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize winner. Milton Friedman said he would join the brief, arguing it could not advance the public good only if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that you could not extend the public good by extending the term of existing copyright. But there apparently were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of existing copyrights. What there was more than $6 million in contributions from Disney and related interests eager to have their copyright extended, the public demand notwithstanding. Here's a second example. Think about Wall Street. We've just seen this collapse on Wall Street, which triggered a collapse in the economy and economies around the world. What explains that collapse? Well, in this book by Simon Johnson and James Quack, they attribute this collapse to this perverse mix, a mix of both too little government and too much government. Too little government in the sense of deregulation. The 1990s saw this explosion of financial innovations, what we call derivatives. But because of a series of regulatory changes, these innovations were essentially invisible to the marketplace. There was no requirement that these innovations be traded on a public exchange, no transparency obligation, not even an obligation that they comply with anti-fraud requirements. So as my colleague Frank Partnoy calculated, in 1980, 98% of assets traded in our economy were traded on these public exchanges. But by 2008, 90% of the assets traded in our economy were traded in these invisible shadow banking markets. No requirement for public disclosure, no requirement for transparency, no anti-fraud requirements at all. And that, of course, encouraged, Johnson and Quack argues, the bubble that when it burst brought the economy down. But that alone was not enough. In addition to too little government, there was too much government, because through the 1990s there was a clear beacon from the federal government to the financial sector that there was in effect a government guarantee that when this bubble burst, there would be a bailout at the other side, producing what is the dumbest form of socialism ever invented by man. We socialized the risk while privatizing the benefit. We paid the downside, they got the upside. Now, I know this isn't a legal audience, and this is a technical legal term, but let me just describe this as insanely stupid way to architect a financial system. What explains the stupidity? Now, all of that was before 2008. It gets worse after 2008, when the proverbial insult gets added to injury in the context of Congress of the United States. Because after 2008, after the worst crisis since the Depression, after everyone not tied to Wall Street reviewing this crisis concluded on the left and the right that the crisis was in large part driven by the misregulation, by the deregulation of Wall Street, after the dean of deregulation, the Ayn Randian Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve, confessed he had made a, quote, mistake in believing the banks would act in the public interest as opposed to their private interest. After all of that, Wall Street still had the power to blackmail both Republicans and Democrats to give them a get-out-of-jail-free card for what they did before 2008, and to leave the basic financial structure that led to the collapse in place. If the banks were too big to fail before 2008, they're only too bigger to fail after 2008. Now, what explains this repeated inability of us to get financial regulation right? Well, there are lots of possible answers. This is a complex field. No doubt there are lots of misjudgments that come in good faith. But here's the one thing we know. The financial sector and the security sectors had the fastest growth of campaign contributions from 1990 until 2008. And in 2010, they were the largest sector by far, contributing to the congressional elections that brought about this non-reform of Wall Street. Or here's one final example. I'm sure many of you, when you saw these images, had this question in your head about this Deepwater Horizon catastrophe. How was it that such an experimental drilling platform could have been permitted without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? After all, where I come from, we have just spent 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental impact studies to permit the building of a green energy source for producing electricity. So what was the analysis required before this experimental drilling platform was permitted? And the answer is 17 pages of environmental impact analysis before the project was exempted from any further obligation to demonstrate its safety, even in the context of experimental drilling. Now, when Congress heard this, Congress was shocked, of course.
Shocked to find the damage
Yet, of course, it had been Congress that had required this fast-track approval process. And why had Congress required a fast-track approval, even in the context of experimental technologies? Lots of possible reasons. Here's the one thing we know: endless campaign cash driving to this insane public policy choice. Now look, no respectable liberal, libertarian, or conservative could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from each of these political philosophy perspectives. So how is it that they become law? Now, the political scientists are uncertain. They say the political science here is complex, but here's the one thing I'm certain of. I'm certain that you believe you know why. All I have to do is to point to the money, and you believe you know the root cause in each of these cases, and we could spend the whole night going through 1,000 other precisely analogous examples. And my claim is, it is number one, because of cases like these, that Americans believe, quote, money buys results in Congress. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress, according to a study we conducted at the beginning of the year. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing Americans agree about: money buys results in Congress. Leading to number two, that belief erodes trust in the institutions of government. Gallup calculated last year that 11% of Americans have confidence in Congress. They said it's a little bit better this year, 12% who have confidence in Congress. The New York Times and CBS released a poll about a month ago that says that 9% of Americans have confidence in Congress. 9%. Now, we should put that in some context, right? 9%. There were certainly more Americans at the time of the founding of the American Republic who believed in the British Crown than who believe in this Congress today. And that leads to number three: low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote, an organization that registers and turns out young voters, and turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of the American democracy in 2008, and plainly gave Barack Obama his victory, found that in 2010 a significant number of their members were not going to vote. So they polled their members to find out why they were not going to vote. And the overwhelming result, 2-to-1 above the next highest answer, was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in large part because of this belief. Okay, now, it wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't the design of this democracy. Framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic. By a republic, what they meant was a representative democracy. And as the Federalist Papers explained, what they meant by a representative democracy was a government that had a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. So here's their model of government. You've got the people, you've got the government. I do my own slides. It's pretty cool the way that bounces, right, like that. The people and the government, this marionette relationship, a dependency going from the government to the people. Now the problem is, our Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not just a dependence upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the campaign funders. Members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back in power. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters as they constantly adjust their view about what they want to do in order to make sure they can continue to raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the obvious point is that this is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from the dependence upon the people alone, because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. 0.26% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional campaign. 0.05% of Americans max out in their contributions in a congressional campaign. 0.05%. So the Occupy Wall Street people are proud of their "We are the 99% slogan." Bad marketing. They are the 99.95% against the 0.05% who have extraordinary access because they provide the extraordinary resources necessary to fund these campaigns. Now this is, the Supreme Court doesn't recognize this yet, but the Supreme Court will, this is corruption. It is not corruption in the sense of cash secreted around members' offices in brown paper bags. It's not Rob Blagojevich kind of corruption. It's not corruption in the sense of violating any criminal law. I'm not talking about illegal corruption. I'm talking about legal corruption. It is a corruption relative to the baseline of a dependence upon the people alone, because it manifests the wrong dependence. It is, in this sense, dependence corruption, which is a far more virulent and dangerous form of corruption in a mature democracy than the petty bribery that will afflict every single government anywhere in the world. Now, this corruption has an effect. Its effect, first, I submit, is on trust, and trust's erosion erodes participation, and participation's erosion erodes legitimacy. And in a sense, we could say that this is a corruption specific to the United States. But it's also, I want to submit, quite general to modern democracies everywhere in the world. What's general with all modern democracies and everywhere in the world, except for some fortunate nations at the northern part of Europe, is this erosion of trust in the institutions of democracy. What's specific within each of these democracies is the particular reason for that erosion of trust. The reason in the United States is this view money buys results. The reasons elsewhere are different. They are relative to the culture. It might be that insiders have too much power, or that a particular party has a distorting power, or that a dynasty has a particular distorting power. But each of these is increasingly viewed as a corruption relative to what is increasingly becoming a universal view of democracy, that it's a government to be dependent upon the people alone. Now that's an argument. Here's a point about what we can do. It's not hard to describe the problem. And once you describe the problem, it's not even hard to describe a solution. What's hard, and maybe impossibly hard, is to imagine the politics that brings that solution about. Not just in America, but in any mature democracy. Jim Cooper, a Democrat from Tennessee who has been in Washington as a representative for as long as all but about 20 other representatives in Congress, said to me, the single most important problem is that Capitol Hill has become, as he put it, a, quote, farm league for K Street. K Street, the street where lobbyists live. Members and staffers and bureaucrats on Capitol Hill have an increasingly common business model, a business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators left to become lobbyists, 42% of members of the House, and those numbers have only gone up. So this is a system where everyone depends on the system surviving. And so how is it that you can change this system when everyone inside the system depends on it surviving? The challenge is how we find a way around the cancer that has become this spot in the United States, Washington, D.C. Now, one way, and I increasingly think the only way, is for us to learn how to enable what we could call outsider politics. Not the top-down politics of political organizations, but a bottom-up grassroots politics. Not the politics of politicians, but increasingly a politics of citizens. Not the professional politics, but an amateur politics, where amateur means, as with art, people who create for the love of the art and not for the money. In politics, it means people who work for the love of the nation and not for the power. A politics that looks unlike this image, which could describe both culture and politics in the 20th century, this kind of read-only politics where we passively consume what's fed to us and do what is told. Not that politics, but a read-write politics. An active, engaged, and awoken politics, a sovereign that finally comes awake. Now, to do that politics requires that we do two things, each of which are extraordinarily difficult. Number one, that we articulate a cross-partisan message. That number two, aims at the rules of the game, the infrastructure within which politics happens. To do each of these requires an extraordinary discipline. Both of them are impossibly hard in a world where the business model of politics and organization and media resists each of these two ideals. It requires a discipline which is impossibly hard. Because the cross-partisanship ideal faces the reality that all of us love to view the other side as the enemy and rally our own side against the enemy. And the focus on rules faces the challenge that it's our passion for substance, healthcare reform, global warming legislation, equality in an egalitarian society that gets us going, not a focus on rules. Now, in the United States, I think we've had the beginnings, failed beginnings, to this kind of politics. 1998, when President Clinton was being impeached because he lied about having sex with an intern, a group called Move On was launched. At first, an extraordinarily powerful cross-partisan movement that literally said, Congress, move on from this stupid problem to focus on issues that are important to America. But very quickly, that cross-partisan movement fell to the left and became understood as a left-wing organization in American politics. In 2009, the Tea Party was born, at first standing for outsiders and reformers to the political system, and quite quickly it became insiders on the right, focused on how to take control of the Republican Party. And this year, the Occupy movement was born, which at first promised this outsider's power on the left, but I fear too quickly has become a kind of kumbaya movement. Kumbaya, you know what I mean. Kumbaya, Lord. Now, the point is, if these movements could mature, if they could learn to really speak for the 99%, if they could focus on constitutional change, which doesn't necessarily mean an amendment to the Constitution, but a focus on the framework within which democracy happens, if they could do this, I think they could then make trust possible again, if. But we don't know if they can do this. We don't know whether this kind of politics is possible. At least in my country, it's quite plausible. We don't have the capacity to imagine rebuilding this kind of politics. So we don't know whether it's possible, but what we do know is how it starts. And it starts first with a certain kind of clarity. The clarity of Thoreau, the clarity of the root striker. It's this discipline to focus attention, constantly getting Americans to connect the dots between every issue they care about and recognize that as they connect the dots, there is a common source to the distortion they complain about on the left and the right. So, whether it's healthcare reform on the left or government bailouts on the right, whether it's global warming for the left or complex tax systems for the right, whether it's financial reform for the left or financial reform for the right, there is a root cause in this corrupt system, and this is its picture. A government guided not by the people, but by the funders. And what root strikers must do is to get a nation, to get the people to see this. So that's number one, clarity. And number two, it requires a certain kind of courage. So my friend Arnold Hyatt is a humble guy. This is the biggest picture I could find of him on the internet. He was the president of Stride Right Shoes. They make great shoes like Keds. And he's also a loyal Democrat. In 1996, he was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So in 1997, President Bill Clinton invited him to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel with 30 other fat cats to sit around and tell the president what the president should do for the balance of his term as president. Each of them got to address the president. Arnold Hyatt was the last one to speak. We don't have any pictures from the night, but I kind of picture it like this. Arnold Hyatt stood and looked the president straight in the eye, and he said, "Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940, when Roosevelt reluctantly came to recognize that he had to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Because he said, you too, Mr. President, you must convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, a war against fat cats. A war against people who believe that merely because they've been successful in the marketplace, they're entitled to direct government policy. Merely because they are wealthy, they have the right to sit at dinner with the president. People who have convinced America that democracy doesn't work because they've convinced America democracy gets sold to the people who make the highest bid. Now, just picture yourself as Arnold Hyatt, sitting in a small room with 30 other fat cats, pointing to the fat cats and himself as the source of the destruction of democracy in America. There was a little bit of silence after he spoke. The only published account we have of the evening said that, quote, Clinton's response effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Now, 14 years later, we have to recognize that it was Arnold Hyatt who was right that night. We need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But where Arnold Hyatt was wrong was in his belief that it would be politicians who would wage that war. It's not going to be politicians. It's going to be citizens. It's going to be us. It's going to be root strikers. It's going to be some of you. It's our job. It's our courage. It's our republic that's been lost, ours and not theirs. They took it away, but we let them. I'm going to end with one more story. So think a bit about the responsibility this problem presents. I'm sure some of you remember these images from March 1989, when a ship under the command of Captain Joseph Hazelwood ran aground and spilled about 11 million gallons of oil into the Prince William Sound up near Alaska. This was Captain Hazelwood calling in the accident. If you want, so you're notified. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking what many people wondered after that accident, whether Captain Hazelwood was intoxicated when he was captaining a supertanker. He said he wasn't. He said he only had 4 vodkas before he got on ship, but the blood alcohol level said he must have been at least 6 times the legal limit when he got on board. He denied it. His lawyers fought it. They were not able to convict him of being intoxicated at the time of the accident. So let's say that there's some doubt about whether Hazelwood was drunk. What there was no doubt about was that he had a problem with alcohol. His mother testified he had a problem with alcohol. 1985, 4 years before the accident, Exxon had treated him for his problem with alcohol. After the accident, Exxon's president said he thought he had mastered his problem, but in 1986, 3 years before the accident, his driver's license had been revoked for driving under the influence of alcohol, and in 1988, 1 year before the accident, his driver's license was revoked for driving under the influence of alcohol. At the time he was captaining a supertanker, he was not allowed to drive a VW Beetle. All right, now forget, though, about this man. What I want you to think about are those around Captain Hazelwood, the other officers, the people who could have picked up a phone. While this drunk was driving a supertanker, I want you to think about those people who did nothing. What do we think about them? Now, I ask that question because as I think about these issues of democracy lost, I increasingly think we are they. We face these critical problems requiring serious attentions, but with institutions incapable of that attention. They're distracted. They're unable to focus. And who is to blame for that? Who is responsible? It's too easy to point to the evil souls, the Blagojeviches, as responsible. They do their part. But it's not the most important part. Much more important are the good souls, the decent people, the people who could have picked up a phone, us. We are the most important part to this problem. We, the most privileged, because the most outrageous part is that these corruptions may have been primed by the most privileged in our society, but they have been permitted by the passivity of the most privileged as well. Permitted. When Ben Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, he was stopped on a street by a woman who asked, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And he responded, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic. A representative democracy. A government dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. And around the world, we have to act to get it back." Thank you very much.